Wendy Jones felt extremely uncomfortable when she found herself within the walls of the women's block of the State County Jail. She had to get used to the strict daily routine and deal with harsh guards and cellmates who'd done some despicable things in their lives. Wendy didn't consider herself a criminal because she was convicted on false charges. Unfortunately, it was nearly impossible to prove, especially from behind bars, and the woman didn't have any illusions on that account. Thus, Wendy simply accepted her fate, trying to keep a low profile and stay out of trouble. Unfortunately, avoiding every kind of confrontation in prison is virtually impossible. And Wendy was no exception. About a month into her sentence, she caught the attention of one of the long-term prisoners with a very telling nickname, Puma. In fact, the woman's name was Cassandra, but either the prisoner didn't like it, or maybe it was really her temper that earned her the reputation of a predator, but everyone in the prison called her Puma. Having ended up sharing a cell with Cassandra, Wendy quickly realized that she wouldn't be able to avoid an altercation with her. It didn't necessarily mean that Cassandra would try to harm Wendy. She could well limit herself to words only, but inside the prison, words had their own weight too. Wendy's cellmate wanted to persuade the woman to cooperate. She tried to intimidate her, thus making it clear that she couldn't just keep to herself in prison. Cassandra was about 40, but she looked much older. She started that unpleasant conversation suddenly, without any transition or introduction. Wendy tensed up visibly, as she realized that there was no chance that she could stand her ground in a confrontation with Cassandra. At that moment, the poor woman even felt as if the temperature in the cell had dropped by a degree or two. Cassandra loomed over her cellmate like a bear over a defenseless doe and was clearly ready to escalate the situation. However, when things seemed to have heated up to the limit, Puma suddenly took 2 steps back and grabbed her throat. Cassandra's eyes rolled back and a muffled wheeze came out of her mouth. Her strong body slowly sank to the concrete floor, after which the woman started getting seizures. Foamy saliva appeared on Cassandra's lips, which made Wendy immediately realize that her cellmate was probably having an epileptic seizure. Thankfully, the woman had previous experience with those, so she knew exactly what to do. First, she rolled Cassandra onto her side to eliminate the risk of suffocation. Then she used a teaspoon to open the woman's tightly clenched jaws to make sure she could get some oxygen in. About 5 minutes later, Cassandra started feeling better as the attack gradually subsided. "Oh, that's much better," Wendy whispered and stepped aside. Cassandra grimaced in displeasure and threw a wary glance at her cellmate, asking, "So, what just happened? Did you save me or what?" I did save you," Wendy answered timidly. The way Cassandra saw it, a real miracle had just happened in her cell. But it was very hard to believe because miracles didn't usually happen in prison. The hardened criminal suddenly got a strange feeling in her soul, something she'd long forgotten she could even experience. And if she did ever get this feeling now, she usually tried to shove it as deep down as possible. Looking at Wendy gratefully, Cassandra asked, "Listen, where did you learn how to do this? All this medical stuff?" Wendy looked sadly at her companion and shook her head. At that moment, the woman's mind went dizzy and tears filled her eyes. Images and scenes from her past merged into a single whole, taking the unfortunate woman on a trip down memory lane. Wendy was transported to a place where plains and fields knew no bounds, and the lowing of cattle could be heard for miles. Wendy lived on a farm with her mother and her grandmother, and never even thought about moving to the city. Wendy's father died while putting out a fire when she was 10 years old. Therefore, most of the woman's childhood memories about her father were manifested in a touch of grief on her mother's face. Priscilla Jones had a difficult character, which most people couldn't deal with. For this very reason, Wendy was closer to her grandmother than her mother, whom she considered responsible for all the problems in their lives. Charlotte Jones understood her granddaughter perfectly, which was why they had a great relationship. The old woman used to be a medical worker in the past. She worked at a military hospital that treated soldiers during the war in Indochina. Widowed too early, Charlotte single-handedly raised her daughter and now helped Priscilla raise her Wendy too. It just so happened that it was her grandma who made Wendy feel loved and appreciated as a child. Priscilla Jones often traveled around the state for work, leaving her daughter in Charlotte's care. From an early age, Wendy helped her grandmother with harvesting, feeding livestock, and making preparations for next season. Thus, little Wendy didn't see anything shameful in milking cows, cleaning the poultry house, and being rewarded for it with fresh eggs. Time went by. Wendy had already settled down on her grandmother's farm and even managed to make friends there. When there was no work in the field, the children spent time by the river, where they swam, fished, and just fooled around on the sandy shore. One day, while swimming in the cold water, Wendy felt her right leg start cramping. It was very uncomfortable. The girl's muscles literally stiffened and her body stopped obeying her. "Hey, help! Somebody help!" Wendy screamed, desperately trying to stay afloat. Her friends on the shore didn't immediately understand what was happening, and only one of them reacted almost instantly. 13-year-old Connor Wilson jumped into the water immediately without even taking off his clothes. The boy was known as an excellent swimmer, but he barely managed to get to Wendy at the last moment, just as her head had disappeared under the water. Fortunately, help arrived in time, and Connor was able to pull the girl out before water got into her lungs. Once on the shore, Wendy cleared her throat and looked gratefully at her savior. Connor was a couple of years older than her, but he didn't look it. Connor lived with his parents in a small house located 3 miles away from Grandma Wendy's farm. The teenager's father was a truck driver, which was why he spent most of his time on the road. Connor's mother often bought milk from Charlotte Jones and knew her grandmother rather well. Before the incident in the water, Connor and Wendy were just acquaintances, but afterwards they became real friends. 5 years had passed. Without even realizing it, they were starting to see each other almost every day, which couldn't go unnoticed by Charlotte Jones. "Mark my words, Priscilla. They will make a beautiful couple one day. Just look at them. They're so sweet together," the old woman said to her daughter. Wendy's mother grimaced, but didn't comment on her mother's words. Priscilla Jones never hid the fact that she wanted to move to a big city and take her daughter with her. The woman knew that she had virtually no chance to improve her personal life if she chose to stay on the farm, and therefore she tried her best to achieve her goal. It's hard to say what would have happened next if Charlotte Jones hadn't passed away soon. The elderly woman had complained of chest pains several times before, but she always refused to seek medical attention, saying that she didn't have the time for it. Charlotte Jones died 3 days before her 80th birthday, which came as a devastating blow to her daughter and granddaughter. After her mother's funeral, Priscilla realized that there was nothing keeping her on the farm anymore, and the farm itself immediately turned into a real burden for the woman. Having decided to sell the farm, Priscilla started getting ready to move to New York. However, Priscilla completely disregarded the fact that her daughter was strongly against leaving the farm that had been her home for so long. But that wasn't the only thing that was keeping Wendy in Iowa. More than anything else, the 18-year-old young woman was afraid to part with Connor, who had become so much more than just a friend to her. Love at this age is often pure and strong, which allows one to carry it through years and even decades. "Mom, I don't want to move to New York. I never lived in the metropolis. What am I supposed to do there? All I know is how to milk cows and take care of poultry and crops," Wendy said. "It's okay, dear. You can go into nursing school and then get a job at a hospital. I'm selling this farm. End of discussion. We'll use the proceeds to get a small house in the suburbs of New York," Priscilla said. Pursing her lips resentfully, Wendy went outside, slamming the door. The young woman didn't want to move, but she couldn't stand up to her mother. Of course, the news of her imminent departure shocked Connor, who expected to hear anything but that. "And what about me? What about us?" the young man exclaimed, having a hard time keeping his emotions in check. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do." My mom is my only family," Wendy said with a sob. At that moment, the poor young woman was willing to give up anything only to stay at her grandmother's farm. Unfortunately, Priscilla Jones had her own take on the matter. Having sold the farm for virtually nothing, she burned the bridges behind her and moved to New York with her daughter. At first, Wendy and Connor talked on the phone almost every day, sharing their most intimate secrets with each other. But then they both got busy with their lives and started to fall out of touch. And then Connor told Wendy that he intended to join the Marine Corps, thus devoting his life to serving the country. This news had an effect of a cold shower on young Wendy. Deep down, the woman still hoped that they would be together again one day, but Connor's decision changed everything. Having directed all of her energy to her schoolwork, Wendy tried to come to terms with the idea that her first love, quite unexpectedly, didn't end well. Having plunged headlong into her studies, the hard-working young woman soon became one of the best students in her year, which made her teachers incredibly happy. At some point, Wendy got used to living in the big city, which didn't seem so hostile and alien to her anymore. If only she could have known what was awaiting her in the future. Wendy had just gotten a job at the hospital when her mother got into a terrible car accident. It wasn't Priscilla's fault. Everything happened entirely through the fault of the other driver. The other driver was heavily intoxicated when he drove his truck into the oncoming lane. The impact was so strong that Wendy's mother died almost instantly, and the paramedics that arrived at the scene couldn't do anything to help her. On the day of the tragedy, Wendy was on a shift at the hospital. The news of her mother's death shocked her. "No, how is that possible? Why is this happening to me?" the young nurse exclaimed, breaking into tears. Her colleagues looked sympathetically at the young woman, who, by the will of evil fate, became an orphan in an instant. The funeral and the wake all seemed like a bad dream to Wendy. Standing at her mother's grave, the young nurse couldn't stop crying. She mentally apologized to her mother for having argued with her so often, especially over things that no longer seemed important. Wendy ended up all alone in this world, with no relatives whatsoever, so the woman tried to focus on her work to distract herself from the painful thoughts. The woman readily took on any task that was assigned to her by her head nurse, Amanda Gomez. The astute woman immediately noticed Wendy's compliant nature and started using it for her own benefit. Mrs. Gomez made her take night shifts even when other nurses were supposed to get them. The head nurse took money from the other nurses for getting them out of night shifts and dumping them on poor Wendy. Moreover, Amanda Gomez also took money from the patients, as well as prescribed procedures that they didn't really need. Unlike the head nurse, Wendy never took other people's money and always performed her duties with due diligence and respect for her patients. At some point, the woman tried to stand up to Amanda Gomez and gently hinted that treating patients that way was simply unacceptable. "Who do you think you are? Do you really think I'm going to ask for your permission to do what I want?" the head nurse exclaimed. Realizing that Wendy could become that very whistleblower who would expose her venal behavior, Amanda decided to get rid of her. That didn't mean physically getting rid of her, of course, but the head nurse had come up with a devious plan to get Wendy out of the hospital for good. Being accused for stealing medicines came like a bolt out of the blue for the poor woman. Wendy was always exceptionally careful when dealing with meds and never allowed herself any negligence when filling out records on their use. Trying to prove her innocence in front of the chief, Wendy sincerely couldn't understand what was happening. The inexplicable mess ended with the fact that the nurse was accused of criminal negligence and got arrested. The criminal case was opened so quickly that Wendy didn't even have time to hire a decent lawyer. Unfortunately, the public defender was a recent graduate who had virtually no experience and thus seemed to have hurt Wendy's case in court more than he helped it. Thus, thanks to a chain of unpleasant and seemingly unrelated events, Wendy got sentenced to 3 years to be served in one of the state prisons. And now, standing in front of Cassandra, the former nurse relived the events that led to her arrest and landed her in prison. "I used to be a nurse, and a good one at that," Wendy said quietly sitting on the edge of the bed. The last thing the former nurse wanted to do was make a fuss and attract the attention of the guards, who would easily give her trouble. Cassandra looked carefully at her cellmate and seemed to hesitate for a moment, after which she gave the nurse a thumbs up. At that moment, someone's footsteps were heard down the hall. "It's the warden. Don't say a word about what happened here," Cassandra asked, pressing her index finger to her lips. Wendy nodded. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a tall man in uniform walking over with two guards at his side. The warden turned around and looked at Wendy, who was trembling with fear. The woman really didn't want to face any disciplinary actions, because it would mean that she'd lose her chance of getting out early. The warden came close to the cell and suddenly changed in the face, exclaiming, "Wendy? Is that really you? How did you end up here?" The ex-nurse looked up and saw Connor Wilson standing in front of her. Over the years of separation, he turned into a stately man, nothing like skinny teenager Wendy remembered him to be. Cassandra looked at the warden in surprise and realized that he definitely knew her cellmate. Having opened the cell door, Connor walked over to Wendy and pulled her in for a tight hug. The young people wanted to talk about everything that had happened to them over the years. As it turned out later, Connor served in the Marine Corps for 3 years and then terminated his contract and decided to do something else with his life. Having become a prison guard, the former military man got promoted to a management position in record time. Over the years, he never forgot about Wendy and even tried to send her letters. Unfortunately, all of them remained unanswered because Connor accidentally made a mistake when writing down the woman's address in New York. Crying uncontrollably, Wendy told Connor how she got framed and sent to jail for something she didn't do. Having learned of his ex-girlfriend's problems, Connor promised to help her. It is worth saying that the warden kept his promise and, having turned to the best lawyer in the city, managed to get her case reopened just 2 weeks later. When Wendy had finally gotten her freedom back, there were no other obstacles that could prevent her from being with Connor. The news of the upcoming wedding didn't surprise anyone who knew Wendy and Connor, even though they had briefly found themselves on opposite sides of the law. Having become husband and wife, the young couple proved to everyone that true love can survive even years of separation.